Technology remains still a challenge. Adoption.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this first webinar in our series, Housing 2.0, New Perspectives for Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to begin by thanking our co-organizers, the Urban Housing Practitioners Hub, as well as our partners at IDB Invest for their collaboration on this work on urban transitions and also the Global Covenant of Mayors for the climate and energy work that they're making this possible at this event. Housing 2.0 is a series of virtual exchanges that highlight alternative models and responses that seek to address new social, economic, and demographic demands through innovation, sharing global insights and lessons learned for the Latin America and the Caribbean region. I would like to express our sincere appreciation to all policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and multilateral partners who joined us for this first webinar, Demand Without Supply, Why Housing Fails to Reach Those Who Need It Most. Your active participation, valuable insights, and shared experiences greatly enrich the discussion and contribute to advancing our collective understanding of how to make housing systems more inclusive and more effective. This first webinar will address the mismatch between actual housing demand and market responses, drawing on demographic and social perspectives to anticipate scenarios of exclusion and lay the foundations for sustainable, flexible, and inclusive housing solutions for differentiated demand. At the Inter-American Development Bank, and particularly in our Housing and Urban Development Division, we're constantly seeking innovative tools to address the complex challenges our region faces in promoting inclusive, resilient, and sustainable urban development. On the most urgent of those challenges, we find the why is housing not reaching those who need it most. Households in Latin America and the Caribbean have undergone changes in their composition. As of 2022, households had an average of 3.4 members compared to 3.9 in 2010. However, significant gaps persist between socioeconomic groups, lower income group households, which remain the largest, and the rest of the populations, which in average make 1.7% less members than households in the highest income quintile. Changes in family structures are also reshaping the generational and age composition of households. The share of single generation households increased from 23.2 to 34.2%. There was a significant rise in households where children aged 19 or older still lived at home, increasing from 90% to 29.2%. The percentage of older couples without children also rose from 6.7% to 10.3%, which may be linked to the delayed emancipation of younger generations due to longer periods of education, a shortage of affordable housing, and difficulties that young people face in entering the labor market. And lastly, the proportion of households without older adults decreased from 63.1% to 50.8%. In 2022 also, there was 88.6 million people aged 60 and over, representing 13.4% of the regional population. This growth is expected to continue in the coming years, with projections indicating that by 2030, this age group will increase from 114.4 million people, accounting for 16.5% of the total population, to a larger number. On the other hand, Latin America and the Caribbean still exhibit low levels of banking penetration among middle and low-income populations, and informal employment remains one of the main barriers to housing finance. Mortgage debt as a percentage of the total GDP in LAC averages 8.2%, with significant differences across countries, admittedly, which is low compared to the United States, where it is 53%, and Europe, where it's 42%. There is no comprehensive record of the wage to housing affordability ratio across the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. However, a comparative study of 14 countries reports that in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Paraguay, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic, households earning up to 1 monthly minimum wage are unable to access social housing. In this regard, there are new financial intermediaries providing mortgage credit or microfinance to low, middle, and low income and informal sector populations, as well as limited public-private partnership schemes which constrain efforts to address the housing deficit. Government support programs are primarily focused on ownership and do not consider other types of housing solutions that reflect the diversity of family structures and preferences, such as the purchase of existing housing, self-construction, rental housing, home improvements and expansions, or the acquisition of service plots. Moreover, these subsidies or support programs are typically granted to families with verifiable income who are actually able to access financing, thereby excluding families that are part of the informal economy. Consequently, we need to understand what is demanded today, who demands it, under what conditions, and with what real capacities for payment or self-management. In this way, laying the groundwork for policies, financing, and housing models to respond to contemporary realities. We have a wonderful session today to discuss all these items. The objective of this session will be to explore and better understand the invisible segments of housing demand that remain underserved by housing formal markets. We aim to identify the underlying reasons why formal housing systems fail to adequately respond to these segments, often due to rigid eligibility criteria, lack of tailored financial products, or limited recognition of diverse household needs. Ultimately, the discussion will focus on identifying and proposing flexible and inclusive policy options that can effectively address these gaps, promote equity, and ensure broader access to adequate housing solutions. Today's webinar will guide us through a rich and diverse agenda. We will begin with a keynote presentation by Edgar Pieterse. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Edgar, who will share global lessons from the African and Global South experience. This will be followed by a panel discussion featuring Benjamin Bradlow, Cynthia Goitia, and Kristen Kiefer, offering sociological, policy, and demographic perspectives on the housing challenge. We will then move to case studies from Barcelona and Brazil, rounding our dialogue in practical examples and lessons from the field. Finally, we will close with reflections on policy and innovation pathways for Latin America and the Caribbean, drawing connections and insights to inform future action in the region. With this, let me introduce our keynote speaker. We're honored to welcome Professor Edgar Pieterse as our keynote speaker. Professor Pieterse is the founding director of the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, a leading institution dedicated to urban research and policy in the Global South. With extensive experience working across Africa and other regions of the Global South, he brings a unique and critical perspective on the fragmentation of urban demand and its profound implications for housing and urban development strategies. His work sheds light on how urban inequalities manifest in complex and often informal ways, challenging conventional planning approaches. Today, we will share key lessons from the African contexts, including innovative policies and regulatory frameworks that have emerged to tackle housing and urban challenges. And he will also offer valuable insights into how some of these solutions could be adapted for Latin America and the Caribbean. With that, Edgar, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Tatiana. Really appreciate the generous introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. As I said in sort of a LinkedIn response to the advert of this webinar, I really agree just because I wanted to be in the room and learn from all the experts in the room. Now, as any good academic or student, I prefer to follow a brief, and I got a very clear brief from the organizers, from Arena in particular, and I will try and respond to it. And so the 4 questions I was asked to reflect on included exactly the points that Tatiana was making about the fragmented shape of demand for housing, to look at specifically the difference in how informality manifests in Africa. I'm not really going to focus on the rest of the Global South just because of time. And then whether there are any regulatory lessons that could be of relevance to the Latin American Caribbean context. And lastly, how to think of that in terms of strengthening housing systems. So I'll work through this and I'll try and be mindful of the 15 minutes that have been allocated. But Tatiana, please feel free to reprimand me if I'm going over time. I'm happy to shut myself down. So the first point to make is that I'm not a housing expert at all. And so I think it speaks to the need to broaden the debate that I've been invited to make these opening remarks. But obviously, I do work within the larger urban development and urban governance framework, and housing is clearly a very important constitutive element of that. So I come at it from an angle, not as a deep specialist, but as someone with a very strong interest and interested in the intersection with other dimensions of the urban question. So I thought what is maybe most relevant is to give you some detail on the specificity of the African context. And this is important because, of course, Africa's urban transition is happening 2-3 decades after Latin America. And it is at a very different moment in terms of the global economy, in terms of global geopolitics. We're, of course, in the midst of a collapse of our multilateral systems, and this has profound implications for how we think about development frameworks and pathways going forward. But a few empirical points to anchor us. So already Africa's urban population is just over 600 million, so it's greater than Latin America. And this number is expected to double within just the next 25 years. What this means in practice is that 2/3 of Africa's cities and built environment is yet to be constructed. So this represents an incredible opportunity, as you can imagine. But given the enormous deficits that we already see in terms of access to basic services and affordable shelter, it is an absolutely daunting challenge. And the data points that I'll lay out for you will just really underscore the scope and scale of the challenge. This is data that have been aggregated by probably the organization that should be doing this keynote, the most knowledgeable knowledge repository on housing and housing markets in Africa is the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. They do an annual yearbook where they provide a statistical overview on the housing challenge and the affordability crisis at the heart of it, which you can download off their website. It gets published every November of every year. In a 22 report that they did for the African Development Bank, they laid out this overview. And as you can see, about just over 1/3 of African countries have their slum prevalence rates below 50%, but by far the majority of these countries have their slum populations above 50%, and it is as extreme as 82% in Chad or the DRC. And as you can see, the urbanization rates are still robust across the continent, and in particular in West Central and East Africa, and therefore we're expecting urban populations to treble within the next 25 to 30 years in those regions. But what is more important and what has to be considered in relation to the housing crisis is the structure of the labor market. So what this graph shows is that except for a few of the island economies, every single African country, the predominance of its labor market is informal employment. That's the orange component of the bar graph. And of course, where we don't have data like Equatorial Guinea and Eritrea, you can see that unemployment is minuscule, but the numbers are probably very, very similar. And so this is really relevant because it goes to the heart of the affordability question and the rate of inflation as it pertains to housing in these cities. So the third element that is distinctive is that Africa is the only world region where structural poverty is still growing. In fact, World Bank data tells us that 2/3 of the world's share of extreme poor in 2022 lived in sub-Saharan Africa. And this needs to be considered in relation to the fact that sub-Saharan Africa only accounts for 18% of the global population. So this is a massive challenge. And so we're not only dealing with inequality, we are still dealing with profound and deep structural poverty. So to sort of understand the structure of the labor market and how that translates into household income, it is noteworthy that up until the 2000s, growth rates were very anemic in most parts of the Africa. And then in the mid-2000s and just around the financial crisis, we saw really robust growth rates. The blue line there is Africa overall. The red line is sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see, you had growth rates well above 6% even after the financial crisis of 2008. And then, of course, a significant dip, and that has shifted. But what is important, what this obscures, is the fact that GDP per capita has not grown at the same pace. And so you can see over a 15-year period, as the chart shows on the left, that countries like Libya, Sudan have had negative GDP growth rates, even South Africa over that period. But of course, you've got exceptions like Ethiopia and Rwanda, that was 75%. So, but what is important about this sort of significant growth rates in some African countries is that it is off the base of a very, very low base. So if you look at the global distribution of low income and lower middle income countries, they are predominantly in Africa. And in fact, 23 of the world's 32 low-income countries are in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And this is important because what we're seeing is that GDP per capita numbers are flatlining more or less, even though we are seeing growth rates now between 2.5% and 3%. And this then is a useful context to understand this finding from CAF, the Center for Affordable Housing Finance that I mentioned earlier, where they show the minimum cost of an affordable house if it is built by the private sector, 40 square meters. And given that income distribution and GDP per capita number, this is unaffordable for most parts of the African continent. And this just unpacks that data a little bit further and demonstrates the blue component is annual household expenditure on housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. And as you can see, for a significant share of the households, it is more or less half or above half of total household expenditure. And that then is correlated with the price for the cheapest newly built house, which was the previous data that I showed you. So there's indeed, unsurprising, a massive affordability challenge in most parts of the African continent. Now, what we know is that the affordability challenge will likely deepen because of the rate of urbanization, as I've mentioned before. And what we've seen over the last decade is that real estate inflation has outpaced wages by a significant margin. So, the second part is just how does this manifest, and it's to give us a slightly more qualitative dimension to these trends. So physically, what we see is vast, sprawled urban settlements, very low densities or medium densities at best. And informality, the form that it takes is very distinct from Asia and from Latin America. So most people build with a combination of plastic, timber, and mainly zinc, which is metal sheets. And these tend to be recycled or offcuts that have been entered the informal economy and then repurposed for housing purposes. Presents all kinds of problems in terms of resilience in a much more dramatically impact environment in terms of climate change impacts, both ferocity and intensity of particularly flooding and increasingly droughts as well. What we then have is, over and above that physical form that is highly distributed and sprawled out, is a lack of access to network infrastructural systems. So what you have is you've got these makeshift hybrid network infrastructures where informal and intermediary service providers hack the formal system, which is still very much the footprint of the old colonial core, and they repurpose that through an informal economic framework into informal settlements and into slums. This helps with the affordability question, and it's much more adaptive to the needs of these households, but it presents enormous challenges in terms of leveraging finance to upgrade those systems into more systematic network infrastructures that can benefit from economies of scale and therefore bring down unit costs. So how, in that context, what kind of innovative regulatory and policy responses do we see? Unfortunately, very few that I could find or that I can refer to. This is a scene from Ethiopia, which is one of the largest public housing programs on the continent. But what Ethiopia has done mirrors what a lot of other African countries have done. So we've seen over the last 15 years or so, presidents come into office and they promise 1 million houses. I'm sure you've heard this refrain in many Latin American countries as well. So these are these ambitious public housing programs. The top left example is in Luanda, in Angola. The middle example is Kenya, very recent development. And then, of course, the infamous Eco Atlantic in Lagos, in Nigeria, referred to by the real estate developers as the future Dubai of West Africa, and that marketing is with all seriousness. The problem is that these initiatives, and again, as a little bit that I know, similar to Latin America, they commit the same planning mistake over and over. Political leaders simply do not understand the affordability dynamic of these programs, especially in a context of very low GDP per capita numbers and where inflation is spiraling, both in terms of materials, but also land cost. And so what you see is that best case scenario, the targets, they underperform dramatically. So instead of 1 million, they do perhaps 40,000, but then that actually gets reallocated in the market to civil servants as opposed to the urban poor that it was ostensibly geared towards at the outset. And, and I see this in Rwanda, partially in Ethiopia. It's a slightly more different and interesting story. Certainly in Kenya, certainly in Angola, certainly in Nigeria, where also the delivery numbers have been a lot lower. So that's sort of the dynamics that we see. And within this context, there still seems to be a tendency that, oh, if I become the leader, if I become the president, one of the signature things I should be doing is these rollout of these mass housing programs, which have had very disappointing results to date. If you're really interested in more grounded interstitial innovations, there's a really fantastic set of case studies on the Center for Affordable Housing Finance website, where they are delving into these. Very few of these provide aggregate scaled examples, but they do give us a sense of the enormous variation and testing of different approaches that is happening in the continent. I obviously don't have the time to go into any of this, but I just wanted to make sure you know where to access the information. At the heart of this, and this is a framework that has been very carefully developed by CAF, by the Center for Affordable Housing Finance, where they are absolutely convinced that the reason why we are seeing such a mismatch in access to affordable housing is because markets are not working for the poor. And so what they've done is to really clarify in an incredibly helpful way the entire system of housing delivery, which is that row at the bottom, which is the housing delivery value chain, from land assembly all the way through to titling, bulk infrastructure, the actual construction process, how you would facilitate offtake, what the regimes for maintenance and ongoing improvements might be, and how that should be embedded within social and economic infrastructure to make this not just housing, but human settlements. And then to work back how you would need to recalibrate the financing instruments to achieve that. And of course, within that, what are the different kinds of incentives and regulatory prods that you could put into the system to get the actors across the financial system to respond appropriately, whether that be public sector agencies, pension funds, rental housing institutions, etc. And then, of course, lastly, how one would tap available capital markets, whether this is in terms of strengthening taxation systems all the way through to private capital markets and so on, where there's an understanding of what the dynamics would be in these markets. So, of course, you can immediately see the enormous value of this, and this has really helped with national planning, with having Pan-African conversations, and it is absolutely moving the dial in bringing much greater coherence to the system. However, again, I think that it is, in my view, only part of the story, that we absolutely have to go beyond the assumption that these dysfunctionalities can all be resolved within a market framework. So I want to conclude then with just a couple of conceptual pieces that I think can help us with what that broader framework might be. And Tatiana, if it's okay, I'll need another 3 to 4 minutes to just wrap this up. So the first piece is to really understand that we cannot just think of housing or access to land as a vertical within the urban development framework. Given the parameters of, given the need to operate and to remake our urban systems within planetary boundaries, we've got to fundamentally transform our urban planning, design, and regulatory paradigms to achieve at the same time a transition in infrastructure technology so that it's more sustainable, really focus on carbon sinks as a basic principle for how we are going to build in the future, and knit that together with placemaking frameworks that is consistent with nature-based solutions. This will, of course, require an absolute revolution in terms of planning, zoning, and regulatory reform. It's very early days. I think the work of an interesting lab like TL or Dark Matter Labs provide really useful clues about what that might be. But of course, to think that you can have regulatory reform without a very explicit and sustained set of political claims is to completely miss the point. And so I think it is interesting that we are seeing new kinds of social movements emerging, that things like the just transition becomes a reference point and anchor for these new forms of claim making. And what I'm convinced, looking at, for example, some of the innovations in Brazil and India, is that the increasing recognition that public digital infrastructure platforms has to be a public good can fundamentally underpin these different domains of radical reform. And of course, it requires us to engage with questions of customer need, of citizen desire, and how we embed this within a different approach to multi-level governance. Now, this is a large framework, but just to say that we have to never fundamentally de-link the housing and land access question from this broader sustainable urbanism canvas. Secondly, we have to then think very deeply about the knot of governance challenges. This is ultimately about politics, and we've got to recognize that politics translates into institutional inertia. It translates into an incapacity to deal with dynamics of path dependency, and it often doesn't have a response to the reality of very weak revenue-raising capacities and small tax bases, especially in contexts where the informal economy predominates. And so how we think systematically and carefully through these domains in relation to where we want to go is fundamental. And finally, I think that we also need to entertain much more radical frameworks that basically suggest that we need a completely different set of principles that take the idea of natural and social interdependencies as a starting point, and therefore fundamentally decenters an individualistic-centered, market-oriented framework for thinking about governance, regulation, identity, collective, social attachment, and so forth. And this then helps us to begin to think of a very different universe of regulation, what Dark Matter Labs calls deep code innovation, where you can rethink the basis of financing, rethink systems of governance that insist on a radical horizontality. Now, I'm not saying these are things we can plug and play tomorrow, but there are a set of experimentations happening here, which I think get closer to the systemic drivers of the system failures that we see at large, particularly within our cities and within our housing markets. So I hope these frameworks can maybe help lay the basis for what some of these cross-regional conversations could be, all in aid of thinking through what the innovation ecosystems are that we genuinely need to build from the ground up if we are going to make any progress, both at a case study, site level, right through to the systemic, regulatory, and political domains. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edgar. It was fascinating. We have quite a few questions in our chat. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start with one, and then we can continue some of the other excellent points later on in as part of the panel that will follow your intervention. But I did not want to miss this opportunity to ask, because I think the framework that you have presented, the opportunities, at multi-level, the principles that you just candidly, shared with us, are to a large extent, a new paradigm for much of the work that we do. Now, I know that a lot of the work that we have done or that you have presented today applies to Africa because of the background and the area of work that you're, predominantly working in. But how do you think some of these might be brought over to Latin America and the Caribbean? And do you see differences in the context that may, in some instances, pose a challenge for adapting, to this new region?
Sure, thanks, Tatiana. So you've opened up the sort of the door to a hobby horse of mine. So I really believe that we are long overdue for, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, et cetera, to build and invest in a knowledge ecosystem that connects with our regional universities, with city innovation ecosystems at the city level that brings the municipality, social actors together, where we can continuously move between radical experimentation, building an archive, documenting what is going on, because we need to also train hundreds of thousands of new urban professionals. And as a teacher, we don't have the case studies, right? We just don't document what we do. And I mean, for example, in one of our housing programs, there's a 2010 edited volume that the Inter-American Development Bank sponsored on social urbanism, which I still teach with, right? This comes from 2010. It's just because there's such a paucity. It was edited by Rojas, I think was his name. I think he was there at the time. Anyway, the point that I'm making is that we need an innovation fund, basically, that, really can systematically scale the applied problem-driven research that we need to do. And then I'm not so concerned about comparability, because the issue is that if you have a practitioner in Sao Paulo sitting and listening to the challenges of a practitioner in Johannesburg or Addis Ababa, just that exercise of listening and thinking through their challenges actually strengthens their policy planning muscle to solve, because they just see their own issues in a slightly different way. They can see what they take for granted that is actually an asset, but they can also see how the experience that they've had with a little bit of a tweak can actually have an enormous impact in another context. And I think apart from the knowledge piece of it, there's something about the kind of urban professional that we should be investing in that is nimble to move between fields, between contexts, and as a result of that has enough reflexivity to problem solve quicker. Because the problem is that, we don't have enough urban professionals that's nimble enough to deal with the newness of a lot of the challenges, but also that is sufficiently experienced to know that certain things just requires a certain kind of linearity, right? You need a problem definition, you need to design a program to respond, it needs money, it needs people, and you need to execute. And execution is always between 6 to 8 years before you really see an impact. So that kind of, sort of tacit understanding of being a grounded urban practitioner, but that is also open to new ways of thinking and doing, I think a structured exchange can do that. But the starting point is that at the moment, no one invests in this kind of knowledge building, let alone knowledge transfer. And I really think a partnership between our regional research universities, technical schools, and development banks, I think we can just do it across the Global South. That's my view. Thanks.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you for your time, for your excellent presentation. I would love to continue.
Sure.
Maybe what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the panel, and then we can just all carry on together. Thanks again. With that, I would like to introduce our panel. This follow-on panel is going to invite us to reflect on the dimensional challenges that we face, in the context of housing policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. We're going to try to draw from sociological, political, and demographic perspectives, and we will do so exploring critical questions such as what factors explain why some cities are able to redistribute urban goods, such as housing, more equitably, while others tend to just reproduce existing inequalities. Hopefully, we'll also be able to cover other areas like what does it mean to acknowledge and respond to the housing demand for those living and working informally, who are traditionally excluded from formal housing systems. And additionally, the panel will examine the trends and challenges posed by accelerated population aging and how the demographic shift must inform both public policy and housing supply action, if you want, or lines, in order to meet the evolving needs of the households across our region. With that, I'm going to introduce the first of our panelists, Benjamin Bradlow. Benjamin is Assistant Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. He's also a visiting researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. And in addition to that, he's also a CIFAR Azrieli Global Scholar in Humanities Urban Future. Benjamin research offers a comparative perspective on how cities navigate the politics of inequality, redistribution, and also how access to housing and urban goods can be better achieved. We're going to have Benjamin join us right now. Benjamin, you have about 10 minutes for your your messages, your exhibition. And then we'll pass on to our next panel. And then later on, for everyone else, we'll come back to questions and answers. So if you have anything that is urgently or that you want to ask our panelists, please just place it in our questions and answers tag. Thanks very much. Over to you, Benjamin.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. I just want to check you can see the slideshow correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So I in a way, I hope this short talk picks up from where Edgar left off, still in a comparative vein. I want to talk about some recent research that was published exactly a year ago in my book, Urban Power, published by Princeton University Press. And what I do in the book is draw from extensive field-based research in Johannesburg in South Africa, and Sao Paulo in Brazil, to argue for a set of conceptual tools that can help to explain why some cities are more effective than others in reducing inequality. So Joburg and Sao Paulo are each among a group of 41 so-called mega cities that are anticipated to be home to at least 10 million people over the next 10 years. And informal settlements are a quintessential image of this inequality, as you can see in these recent press clippings. What I do in the book is show that while both cities are clearly very unequal and have both pursued policies to reduce inequality, they're not equally unequal. And this is particularly so in the provision of public goods, often by local government. And what's important with these cases, and this is not uniform across Latin America, but this is certainly true across a number of Latin American contexts, is that local government has been allocated a lot of fiscal and legal authority to take charge of the provision of urban public goods. And in my book, I focus on three kinds of public goods: housing, collective transportation, and sanitation. Today, I'm largely going to talk about housing, and in the way that I bring in sanitation, it's through the lens of housing and land use law. Sorry, let's keep this going. So each city has generated policies that are intended to reduce what are conceived as backlogs of housing demand, but they've done so in very different ways. So government-subsidized housing projects in Johannesburg are delivered exclusively in the existing peripheries where apartheid once designated Black-only townships. And these projects are on undeveloped so-called greenfield land, where residents of informal settlements are subject to frequent evictions from both local government and private landowners. And in Sao Paulo, in the book, I document a set of policy tools that the city has used to reserve land for housing projects relatively outside of the market, as well as to upgrade existing informal settlements where they are what planners and architects refer to as in situ upgrading. And as a result, the city has largely ended communal evictions by local government. So the effects of these policies have also changed conditions within informal settlements. And that's why I was happy that Edgar brought up the physical context of informal settlements and not just the aggregate statistics of housing provision. Because one of the key dimensions of the physical context of informal settlements is the provision of services like sanitation. So I took these statistics here from the first census after transitions to democracy in both cities and the most recent census during the period that I was studying for this book. There have been very recent censuses that would update these stats slightly, though there are some methodological issues that have emerged with those censuses. Both cities have had informal settlement populations between 10 and 15% throughout the period that's represented here, but the quality of life in these areas has diverged significantly. In Joburg, the share of households in informal settlements with a toilet in the household was 36% in '96, and that rises slightly to 47% by 2011. And in effect, what you're looking at in these maps here is that there's no major discernible trend across time. In Sao Paulo, the share of households in informal settlements with a toilet was actually lower than Johannesburg at 25% in '91, but this almost tripled by 2011 to 68%. And here in these maps, you see a kind of linear darkening of the maps, which represents that increased provisioning over time. So compared to Johannesburg, it's fair to say that Sao Paulo is clearly a positive case, and there's also substantial literature among Brazilian researchers that's shown that improvements in Sao Paulo are particularly notable among a highly variable range of cities, even within Brazil, which underscores the point that while certainly local governance and local government cannot be totally disconnected from larger scales of action. It's a meaningful scale at which to analyze change. So all this divergence between Joburg and Sao Paulo led me to focus on an empirical puzzle, which is why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequalities? The methods that I undertook for this research were largely field-based interviews with all of the key actors who are involved in policy conflicts over housing, collective transportation, and sanitation. And this was augmented with a range of archival research in both cities. And after my research in the field, what I want to do in this presentation is largely just kind of get the ideas out here. I'm going to talk about some specific tools, but I know that some of the other speakers are going to be much more empirical. So I want to provide some conceptual scaffolding here. And what I found is that two factors explain when and why the local state is capable of changing the distribution of public goods in the city. The first is a local state that is embedded in civil society. In particular, I focus on the role of citywide housing movements, and I define embeddedness as the ties of the local state to civil society that produce the ideas and space within bureaucratic agencies for redistributive policy change. So I was looking for things like, do mid-level bureaucrats in the city regularly interact with movements demanding things that they're supposed to be working on? Are there movement actors even within the bureaucracy itself? And then the second factor is what I call cohesive institutions. And I define cohesion as the coordinating capacity of the local state to implement policy changes. And this is not just a general form of what we often call state capacity. Municipal government is distinctive because it's a delegated scale that's regulated through a national institutional framework. So cohesion captures these distinct dimensions of coordinating delegated authority. We can think of a horizontal dimension, coordinating line agencies within local government, as well as a vertical dimension, coordinating across scales, local and state and provincial, national and federal government. So this leads to a 2x2 conceptual framework where we can think of different types of configurations of local government, characterized by different configurations of low embeddedness and low cohesion. And I want to underscore that no city is immutably in one of these ideal types. And part of my task in this book was to show why time and sequence are critical for understanding why cities are characterized by high or low embeddedness or cohesion at different points in time. So in Johannesburg, in a nutshell, the story here is that we see a weakening political and social support from local government's base in social movements in the former Black townships to countervail the structural power of elites in the city. And given the racialized context of South Africa, these elites are traditionally white. And what I show in the book is how these elites organized a lot around the color line to pursue hidden strategies to undermine redistribution-oriented reforms, particularly oriented at undermining the fiscal capacity of the local state. I call these hidden strategies weapons of the strong. And what you have today in Johannesburg is a city government without capacity to regulate land in such a way that it can achieve its redistributive goals. In Sao Paulo, you see, in contrast, a very continued mobilization of multiple generations of housing movements at the citywide scale that operate as a countervailing force. And traditional elites in the city, which in many ways are more powerful than the elites in Johannesburg, are forced to reckon with a more redistributive vision of the city. This is oriented through policies that encourage housing movements for self-build, neighborhood-based housing programs. You also see the emergence of a municipal master planning tool, particularly a tool called the Zones of Special Social Interest, which allows the city to designate well-located land for housing projects and in situ slum upgrading. And ultimately, you see an increased local capacity to finance and plan for redistribution, not only under left-wing political administrations in the city, but increasingly under subsequent center-right political administrations as well, who continue to work with housing movements. So this is kind of the history that I tell in this book, this movement of each of the cities to different ideal types in these configurations of embeddedness and cohesion. And I know I'm running out of time, but what I want to just note is that this framework allows me to talk about a number of different cities across the world, both in the global north and the global south, in order to understand variation in capacities to distribute urban public goods. And I want to suggest that this kind of comparative framework might be helpful for thinking about other cases, particularly in the Latin American context, that I know many of the other panelists are thinking about, as well as some of the audience members who might want to engage in this discussion later in the webinar. So thank you very much for allowing me to outline some of the ideas that I present in the book, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I think it's an excellent presentation of the book for everyone else that wants to delve deeper into the contents. At the same time, we will have space for further questions to Benjamin. So keep on bringing them on the question section. And in the meantime, we're going to pass on to our next panelist, Cynthia Goitia. Cynthia is the founder and director of the Center of Urban and Housing Policy at the University of Torquato Di Tella in Buenos Aires. Cynthia is also a leading scholar on urban economics and housing policy in Latin America, with extensive research on urban inequality, land markets, and local governance. Her work has informed major housing and urban policy reforms across the region, bridging academic research and practical implementation, which I think is critical to make things happen. So with that said, Cynthia, I wanted to give you this space and a huge welcome. It's great to see you online as always. Over to you.
Muchas gracias, Tatiana. I decided to talk in Spanish. Yo soy de Argentina, así que he decidido que iba a ser mi presentación en español. Así que acá voy a compartir mi presentación. Ustedes me van a decir si la ven bien. ¿Se ve bien?
Se ve bien, se ve perfecto.
Se ve bien.
Sí, tenemos un pequeño mensaje ahora que aparece. Ahí está, pero en cuanto a
Ahí
los
está.
gracias, Cynthia.
Perfecto.
And very
Bueno,
briefly for everyone, you have translation services in Zoom. So for those that do not speak Spanish, please change channel so that you can follow Cynthia's presentation. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Tema de este webinario: la transformación demográfica y de los mercados laborales en América Latina y el Caribe, que desafían en gran parte los supuestos que están sustentando hasta hoy los marcos de política pública en temas de vivienda, ¿no? Para ser por ahí aún más concreta, hoy cuando hablamos de informalidad estamos abarcando no solo a los tradicionales vendedores ambulantes y trabajadores de la construcción, sino que se extiende todo esto a arreglos laborales híbridos, trabajadores de plataformas digitales, profesionales independientes, que diluyen de alguna manera esta separación, ¿no?, que teníamos antes entre lo que es empleo formal e empleo informal. Esta conceptualización más amplia es muy importante también para la formulación de política pública y, según la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, aproximadamente 50% de la fuerza laboral urbana y en especial en América Latina está en esas condiciones. Y entonces mi brevísima presentación de hoy va en este sentido, ¿no? De explorar 3 dimensiones: reconocer las diversas formas de demanda habitacional informal, comprender las estrategias contemporáneas de acceso e identificar mecanismos institucionales para el financiamiento de un hábitat un poco más inclusivo. Entonces, dicho esto, la primera pregunta que me formularon es: ¿qué significa reconocer la demanda habitacional de quienes viven y trabajan informalmente? Y bueno, lo que les puedo decir es esto, ¿no? Primero, un gran desafío a estas categorizaciones binarias de empleo formal e informal, dado esta transformación en el empleo que vivimos en muchos países de América Latina y el Caribe, incluyendo los trabajadores de plataforma, gig economy, y toda esa importante fuerza laboral urbana. Entonces, podemos vislumbrar que desde el punto de vista, y después lo voy a entrar un poco más en eso, en temas de financiamiento, bueno, tendremos que empezar a entender otras cosas, ¿no? De la homogeneidad, de pensar que la informalidad es un grupo, o los trabajadores informales es un grupo homogéneo, a pensarlo como una diversidad, reconocer que no son una categoría monolítica, sino que incluyen diversos grupos de hogares. Y eso significa también no solo aceptar sus formas de ingreso, sino crear otras condiciones de oferta que el mercado por sí solo no provee, ¿no? Desde la oferta de suelo servido, bien localizado, subsidios para vivienda o créditos para mejoramiento o mercado de alquiler, etcétera. Y la demanda informal se diferencia en 3 dimensiones críticas. Primero, la dimensión espacial. Para un trabajador informal, la localización, donde se localiza su vivienda, es una necesidad económica, ¿no? Implica acceso a oportunidades, acceso a empleo. Y a su vez, muchas veces necesitan espacios multifuncionales, porque también dentro de esa economía informal se trabaja desde su garaje o desde alguna sala de su casa. Segundo, la dimensión económica. Sus ingresos son irregulares muchas veces, invierten de manera incremental y eso es importante tenerlo en cuenta. Y por otro lado, la dimensión legal. La mayoría no puede comprobar ingresos formalmente, pero operan en mercados de alquiler muchas veces basados más en la confianza, alquileres informales, por ejemplo, o relaciones personales. Y lo que vemos sí es que más recientemente hay una aceptación a otros instrumentos de pago. Por ejemplo, tenemos hoy la huella digital, que es muchos de estos empleados, de trabajadores informales cobran con plataformas y tienen entonces un registro de todas sus transacciones y todos que, si bien no pueden comprobar ingresos, sí les puede servir para hacer, o sea, como comprobante de pago o de ingresos en algunas, o de capacidad de pago en algunas situaciones. Entonces, estas son variaciones muy importantes que existen hoy con respecto a cómo entender la informalidad. La segunda pregunta que me hicieron es: ¿cómo está accediendo la población informal a soluciones habitacionales hoy? ¿No? Y yo voy a identificar 5 mecanismos principales, pero lo importante es entender que la mayoría de las familias combinan varios de estos mecanismos, ¿no? La primera es la construcción incremental. Y si miramos a América Latina, yo creo que 70% de la vivienda que se construye en América Latina se hizo de esta forma. Las familias compran un lote, construyen progresivamente a lo largo de 10 o 20 años, invirtiendo de acuerdo a su capacidad de pago y lo que le permiten sus ingresos. Esto en sí mismo es un mecanismo muy poco eficiente, ¿no es cierto?, de planificación financiera. Es nada sofisticado, pero es poco eficiente. El segundo mecanismo, y probablemente el más grande en volumen, son los mercados informales de suelo y de vivienda. Desde los loteadores informales que existen en muchos países de América Latina, ¿no?, como un submercado muy importante, propietarios de tierra o intermediarios que subdividen y venden lotes informales sin servicios de infraestructura, etcétera, con dimensiones que probablemente son menores que las que establece la normativa y que por eso el lote formal es poco asequible para estos hogares. o si no, todo lo que tiene que ver con el mercado, o sea, la compra-venta también de viviendas en barrios populares, y después también el mercado de alquiler informal, algo de lo que es muy importante, es invisible en la mayoría de las políticas, en asentamientos muy consolidados, barrio 31 en la ciudad de Buenos Aires, tenemos 30 o 40% de los hogares que son inquilinos, no propietarios, ¿no? Entonces, eso es muy importante, son contratos basados en confianza o conocimiento, y tienen otras formas probablemente de pago, pero es muy importante que cuando diseñamos políticas de vivienda casi nunca consideramos a estos inquilinos informales. Un tercer mecanismo son las redes familiares y la vivienda compartida, algo que se empezó a hablar hoy acá, todos estos temas multigeneracionales en una misma vivienda. En realidad, primero por necesidad, muy típico de los migrantes, ¿no es cierto? Que llegan a un lugar, se establecen con una familia conocida y después piensan que eso es transitorio, hoy se convierte en algo más permanente. Cuarto, desarrollos formales de bajo costo, generalmente ubicados en la periferia de la periferia, de baja calidad, que ofrecen un financiamiento que muchas veces tiene un alto riesgo, que está fuera del sistema bancario, y son viviendas que tienen cierto grado de precariedad, pueden no tener servicios básicos o estar a distancias muy largas de donde se localiza el empleo. Y quinto, los programas formales de vivienda, que en general llegan bastante poco en promedio, si tomamos qué es lo que está pasando en la región, en general en América Latina. Yo creo que menos del 10% de la población informal logra acceder a estos programas de vivienda formal. Y bueno, en general el financiamiento de estos hogares es limitado y va desde redes de financiamiento informal o de cooperativas de ahorro, préstamo familiar, crédito de proveedores, grupos de ahorro comunitario, cajas mutuales, o que crean a veces sistemas financieros paralelos a los sistemas formales u oficiales, ¿no? Con menor o mayor grado de formalidad. En algunos países, y esto lo estamos viendo, las remesas es un sistema de financiamiento muy importante que mueve millones anualmente fuera del financiamiento y la banca formal. Y ahí hay un instrumento interesante si hablamos de financiamiento. Y en todo este proceso, ya lo vieron en las otras presentaciones, suelo periférico, porque tenemos una gran falla en proveer suelo servido, asequible y bien localizado en la escala necesaria. Por eso las 6 que nombraba mi colega, las zonas especiales de inclusión social, son una estrategia bueno. Entonces, lo que quiero enfatizar es que hay una brecha importantísima y hay un enorme espacio para los mecanismos, entre los mecanismos informales que usa la gente y los programas formales que los alcanzan. Para seguir con esto, innovación o cómo podemos transformar. Bueno, estamos pensando en productos diversificados, múltiples puertas de entrada al sistema habitacional, no solamente la construcción de vivienda nueva, sino mejoramiento in situ, lotes con servicios y con autoconstrucción asistida, vivienda semilla expandible, alternativas de tenencia, desde la posesión con título de propiedad a otros tipos de instrumentos. Y obviamente un tema que también apareció en algunos de los slides de mis colegas: integración con transición climática, tiene que ser resiliente. Y bueno, innovación regulatoria es muy importante, la oferta de suelo en la escala necesaria, el financiamiento urbano también, esta posibilidad de hacer políticas redistributivas que nombró mi colega recién, también tienen que ver con toda la innovación regulatoria, también innovación regulatoria o productos financieros más flexibles, alineados con patrones variables de ingresos, ¿no? Reconociendo también esta verificación alternativa de capacidad de pago que surge ahora a partir de toda la huella digital. Y entonces mi premisa en estos temas es que ya no podemos pensar en una solución, porque las realidades son muy heterogéneas, y necesitamos un ecosistema de opciones que reconozca cómo funcionan realmente las economías informales. Para cerrar, me preguntaron, bueno, ¿qué papel pueden desempeñar las ONG, los organismos multilaterales y el sector privado en catalizar estas soluciones inclusivas? Yo creo que requiere una solución orquestada de todos estos actores. Los gobiernos, tanto los gobiernos nacionales como estatales y locales, como mostraron recién en la presentación anterior, crear soluciones habitacionales para economías informales, requiere que los gobiernos sean habilitadores, ¿no? Proporcionando también innovación regulatoria. El sector privado puede aportar escala y eficiencia, y las comunidades y las ONG contribuyen en coordinar e implementar en el territorio. Para acciones más concretas para cada sector, bueno, los organismos multilaterales tienen una gran cartera de productos financieros, más recientemente incluyendo a mutuales, banca cooperativa, uso de remesas, hasta crear fondos de garantía permitiendo mejorar condiciones y escala de financiamiento. Por otro lado, es súper importante crear capacidades, ¿no? Y generar mejor información, mejora de datos e información para la toma de decisiones. Sabemos muy poco de toda esta economía formal, de barrios informales y todos estos temas. Necesitamos mucha mejor información para informar nuestras políticas de vivienda. El sector privado, ya tenemos experiencias interesantes de empresas de materiales, de desarrolladores sociales, fintechs, plataformas tecnológicas, reduciendo también costos de transacción. Hay ejemplos interesantísimos para trabajadores informales en Indonesia, donde combinan el hecho de que sea un empleado de una de estas plataformas de transporte con la posibilidad de acceder a cierto tipo de financiamiento. Y estoy hablando de trabajadores que no son considerados trabajadores totalmente formales, y todas las organizaciones de microfinanzas que también tienen un rol muy importante. Y las ONG, como ya dije, coordinando la demanda, contribuyendo a la implementación y en la gestión. Y también está el rol de la academia, recién lo dijeron en la primera presentación, ¿no? Que generar evidencia sobre lo que funciona, documentar, influir también o generar incidencia también en la reforma política. Entonces, para cerrar, tenemos mucha información sobre las transformaciones demográficas y la reconfiguración del mercado laboral que está habiendo en América Latina. Esta evidencia nos sirve para poder informar políticas habitacionales diferenciadas y mecanismos de financiamiento que respondan a esta heterogeneidad que hoy estamos viendo. Y la ausencia de respuestas apropiadas nos puede llevar a perpetuar inequidades en la región. Por lo tanto, ¿qué requerimos? Un reconocimiento institucional de estas realidades laborales, generación sistemática de información sobre demanda habitacional y todo eso para poder informar esto correctamente, y obviamente que esto probablemente requiera modernización de muchos de los marcos regulatorios de política habitacional. Entonces, como dijeron antes, lo dijeron para África, el futuro de nuestras ciudades es endógeno a lo que hagamos hoy, porque está mucho por venir. Bueno, sabemos en América Latina también que las trayectorias urbanas futuras van a ser endógenas a las decisiones de política que podamos hacer hoy, así que me alegra poder estar acá para avanzar y pensar conjuntamente sobre estos modelos urbano-habitacionales más inclusivos. Con esto yo termino y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Cynthia. In the interest of time, I'm just quickly going to pass to Kristen, our third panelist for today. Kristen is Executive Director of Generations United. She leads an organization dedicated to strengthening connections across generations and advancing policies that support intergenerational well-being. Drawing on her experience, she's going to discuss in the next few minutes the trends and challenges that accelerated aging poses for housing policy and supply, but also the opportunities to better integrate older adults into housing solutions. Kristen, we look forward to your recommendations for other regions seeking to promote inclusion of these aging populations and intergenerational communities within their housing agendas. And with that, I pass, I pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And can everybody hear me? And are the slides looking okay?
We don't see the slides, Kristen,
Don't
but
see them. Okay.
not yet, but we see you beautifully.
Okay, let me work on that. Nothing ever works perfectly, does it? So let me get these slides up and shared with you all. But thank you so much. To follow such wonderful and knowledgeable speakers is a little daunting. Nonetheless, I'm here for that challenge and opportunity, and hopefully to provide a slightly different perspective on some of these issues that we're talking about. So I think we are now projecting.
We see them well. We don't see them on presentation mode. We see your screen right now, but okay. Yes, not on presentation mode.
I think it's lagging a little here on my end. Anyways, I will try to get this fixed up. Give me one moment. Any difference there?
No. Oh, no, yes. No, it's perfect. Sorry.
It's good? Okay, great.
Took a few seconds.
Sorry about that. That is probably my fault for sure. But good morning. And I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to this very important conversation. It really is an honor to be a part of this exchange with colleagues across Latin America, the Caribbean, and other regions that have deep traditions of family connection and community connection. And for us, these values are really the foundation of any strong intergenerational approach. We here at Generations United have been in business for about 40 years, really with the lens of trying to strengthen connections across generations. And so housing is an important component of that intergenerational connectedness. We often also support grandparents raising grandchildren. So there's, households with different generations. And we also work with communities on designing spaces, both where young and old can learn from each other. So the experiences I'll share today are from the United States, not necessarily as a model to follow, but as an example of what might spark dialogue, reflection, and adaptation, because we have heard sort of the desire for innovation from some of the other speakers, or bringing community together to kind of figure out solutions to the issues around housing. The basis of my presentation is a report that we released last year, and you can access it both here on the with the QR code or download it from our website. But just to kick it off, across the United States, and I think this is similar to what we heard a little bit earlier with some of the other countries we're talking about, 1 in 6 people are over 65 years old. And by 2034, older adults will outnumber children for the first time. And that's important because we're a caregiving economy here. So a lot of different generations are caring for older adults. So we're going to have the issue of thinking about intergenerationality a little bit different. And I know that Latin America and the Caribbean are experiencing similar demographic shifts. So today I'm really going to focus on how accelerated aging pose challenges for housing, how intergenerational housing creates opportunities for inclusion and well-being. I think one of the questions or comments was, it should be both quantitative and qualitative. So I'll talk a little bit about how we did a little bit of both in this study, and also hopefully providing some ideas for the region, particularly around respecting local traditions and priorities. So, as mentioned, we face housing challenges that affect families of all ages. For us, it is a supply-demand issue and also an affordability issue. So key trends and challenges are the housing costs here. The lack of affordable housing is central, particularly for households at both ends of the spectrums, our older adults who are on fixed incomes, but also younger generations who are entering the market And so families are combining households out of necessity rather than choice. Care and support are also increasingly expensive if you're looking at the holistic view of individuals. Help with housework, shopping, transportation is difficult to afford. For younger families, they have their own challenges with limited childcare options and other community-based supports lacking. One thing that we really hone on is the social isolation and loneliness as growing problems as well. And so housing as a potential solution to some of the social isolation older adults are feeling, wanting to be linked to health and life satisfaction, but they're often limited by transportation barriers, lack of accessible community spaces. And most homes in the US are not designed for aging in place, are not age-friendly communities, or very hospitable to people with disabilities. Few have step-free entrances, accessible bathrooms, etc. And improving accessibility often is not a driving motivation for new housing. And lastly, housing, health, and social services operate in separate systems. We've heard folks talk about trying to get agency collaboration to talk about issues. We are here making small strides, I would say, where policymakers are beginning to see potential in intergenerational housing to kind of reconnect these systems and streamline them in ways that make things a bit easier. I wanted to provide just a few examples so you know kind of what I'm talking about. And I think we heard innovation kind of in the field and through NGOs. So Generations United does work with partners in community who are doing some innovations specifically around intergenerational housing. Three broad models. There's multi-generational households, families of different generations living together. Intentional, what we call intentional intergenerational communities where unrelated households share property, and they have programs that are very intentional about the interaction between the different generations. And then traditional communities, existing neighborhoods that devise shared space or activities. One example here, which is about families who are adopting children out of foster care that have on-site housing, both for older adults who volunteer their time to help with the children and families. Hope Meadows in Illinois and Bridge Meadow in Oregon are two of those. A community in the Treehouse Foundation is in East Hampton, Massachusetts, which is building a second site with communities. And these are larger homes on site for families and affordable smaller cottages and apartments for the older residents. And in New York, there's a mixed income building for residents of all ages. And the shared space is really kind of the way that they come together on rooftop gardens. You can see in the picture here, walking paths, a community center. And just, intentionally pairing youth with older residents to build skills and relationships. So these communities are succeeding through thoughtful design, intentional programming, having the right people around the table, and also the shared experiences that, really lead to connection. And the benefits, we talked about social isolation, so reducing the isolation, improving affordability through pooling resources across generations and expanding access to sort of that informal care, child support, health services. So these communities really build social capital and resilience, demonstrating that when people of different ages share space, everybody benefits. These are all still modest in scale here in the United States, but they show promise, particularly, and you'll hear themes, if there's policy alignment, creative financing, and intentionality in design. So our blueprint, which you can access, I'll just go over it real quickly about 4 strategies and just a real quick synopsis of who helped develop this. It was academia, it was banking institutions, it was our staff and housing experts at universities and elsewhere throughout Washington, and just others around the table that deal with urban planning. So it was a real dialogue, but we also included the lived experiences of people in these communities. And ultimately, we need more data. We need data on how does the outcomes on health, social, and economic benefits. increasing public awareness with developers, local leaders to understand the model, what it is and its potential. And it's more than just having people live in the same building. It's that intentionality. And then, of course, aligning policies with the financing and sharing practical lessons. We've heard about we need best practices. We do have some learning communities with folks that are interested in learning more about this. But just wanted to say that it's a real call to action here for us at Generations United, starting to work with policymakers and others outside of our traditional circles to get this more forefront. And really, these pathways demonstrate international housing or intergenerational housing isn't a niche idea. It's a scalable approach for healthier and more inclusive living. So just lastly, takeaways, hopefully things that you can bring back to your regions, build on the cultural strengths. We know your societies value family solidarity and community life. These are powerful assets for intergenerational design. The cross-sector collaboration goes without saying. The financing and policy tools where we're integrating programs and models and housing and just thinking a little more broadly, as well as promoting learning and visibility, that research, the storytelling, the community exchanges. And so I'll just conclude with, really by grounding housing policy in community values and shared care, the region can lead the way in designing homes that strengthen connections across generations, improve the access to housing and the affordability in some cases, and really support just overall healthier lives for people of all ages. And I will end there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks for, all these, energizing and stimulating insights on how to consider different elements, especially in the context of aging. With that, we're gonna go on to the segment of questions and answers. I just wanted to make sure that all our panelists, are still here with us. And Kristen, I understand that you're a little bit short of time.
I am.
So if you want, I'll start with you very quickly so that you can quickly, I just wanted to ask you, and which are the opportunities that you think we have in Latin America to integrate better the aging population with housing solutions? You've given us a wonderful broad spectrum. I know that these are mostly applied for, these are applied in the States. Considering, elements of, cultural preferences, affordability, what would you say are, where should we start?
Well, I think, for us, the first thing is really listening to what the data are telling us about the challenges.
Okay.
And we've heard a lot of great data that really outlined it much more than I could even give justice to. So I think it's that. I do think the issue of the qualitative data to support that, like really getting a sense of the landscape of the needs, the true needs, but also thinking to that future. And lastly, the innovation part. Start small, like we're trying to do with this particular model. Share it, have the right folks around the table that don't know something, but also might just need others to bounce ideas off of. So start small, a few flowers shall bloom, and then you start informing the policymakers about the true impact. But we need more research on the impact of those social determinants of health.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all your insights. I have lots of questions, so I'm just going to pick 2 or 3 which I hope are complementary. Edgar, if we have time, we'll also hand over to you, but I'm going to start with Ben. Ben, I have a question from Robin Rajak for you. Robin says, thanks for the overview of your book. Could you please elaborate on the role that power dynamics and civil society integration have on, in relation to the large financial windfall gain associated with land use conversions and changes?
Mm-hmm. So I think one That's quite a subtle question, actually. And one example here, I brought up very briefly the tool that was pioneered in Sao Paulo's master planning process on the zones of special social interest, known in the Portuguese acronym ZACE. And on the one hand, this tool has allowed municipal government to reserve often quite well located land for various kinds of social housing initiatives. There is also evidence that shows that there's a lot of speculative investment that arises on the borders of where these projects take place. So it's not to say that this is a perfect tool that does away with market dynamics. But what I want to point to in highlighting this tool in particular, and in a way this takes us back to some of the more speculative and conceptual interventions that Edgar was making towards the end of his talk. This tool has allowed the city of Sao Paulo to explore what provisioning outside of traditional market mechanisms looks like. And this is often in partnership with another kind of political actor, which is social movements for housing. And that means that you're developing an evidence base, a practitioner experiential base, and a set of political relationships between movements and city government that is all able to pursue these kinds of housing experiments. So the reason why I focus on this tool as one example is not that it's a perfect tool that totally removes the power dynamics that are intrinsic to traditional market approaches, but it suggests that the experimental logic of beginning to move outside of the traditional market is possible even in an urban context that is very much dominated by traditional market mechanisms, and that it's been done at a relatively large scale. This is not a matter of, a handful of projects. And so all of that suggests that there's a lot more room for experimentation than what the more traditional discourses around housing provisioning might allow for. And that's kind of what I wanted to highlight here. And in particular, the fact that it's this relationship between movements and city government that enables the countervailing political power to begin exploring these kinds of housing policy experiments.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Cynthia. Again, many questions for you, but I'll just pick one. And this one comes from Washington Fajardo. Washington, is concentrating on the issue of informal rental. And I'll just say it in English. Sorry, you can respond.
No, I speak in English.
Yeah.
Speak in English. I can speak in English.
Okay.
It's okay.
So Washington is saying informal rental units are frequently developed and managed by local residents, and this is, probably an informal feature, an important feature of the market that we're dealing with. And he says, Cynthia, do you think we could be maybe more creative and more ambitious in rethinking tenure and ownership rules for urban informality? For instance, should we consider community land trusts? Admittedly, not all informal settlements are made equal, and scale matters. And this might be more applicable to to small, nascent settlements, or less to those that are large favela complexes. And, should we have different approaches to treat each? So it's, should we basically do something differently, considering the features, if you want, of the informal rental markets that we're facing in the region?
Yes, I totally agree with what Washington is saying. I think that resolving the informal land markets in informal settlements, it's a very difficult task. Think about Barrio 31, for example, and they haven't been able to solve it. They solved many other things, but not this issue, because people invest in one extra room or something like that, which gives them some income for facing expenses. So it's part of the way of living of many families, building another room and putting it in the rental market. I think there is space to be more innovative on that, on try to think about other type of instruments in general in these programs of regularization and giving property rights. I think there are many things that can be done. Community land trust is a very useful instrument. I don't think it's for all the settlements that we can find in the region, but for example, in Puerto Rico, in El Caño, was very useful, and in Boston, in Boston housing, to maintain the affordability of those housing, it is very useful. So I think we need to explore and try to see which will be the best alternative for solving this problem. But I think this needs some type of focus in our policy.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm not sure whether Edgar, is still with us, so he had to step out. So maybe with that said, the best thing, and considering that he's already, Edgar is there. Great, Edgar. I have one more question that I wanted to ask you earlier on from Andres Peña, and who said, sorry about this, I messed up my questions, so now I'm looking for them. So Andres Peña was saying, how can we grow out if we believe that the housing crisis is caused by overregulation of land use? I live in Mexico, and this is the dominating academic and institutional standpoint. How do we go beyond that ideological hurdle?
I suspect it's one of those questions where the person posing the question has the answer. So it'd be great if he just tells us what he thinks. I mean, it's a great question, and I think there's two reflections. One, I think that is a bit of a challenge, that the field goes through fashions and people get obsessed with certain things. I was struck by Benjamin's reflection on the zoning system in Sao Paulo, and at some point that caught fire in South Africa, and it was the only thing everyone spoke about, and it was never implemented. So that's a story for another day. But I mean, so I get his point that the academic debates can get obsessed. I think that we do need to have a discussion about what I would call flexible regulation. So what we know is that you have enormous variation in terms of livelihood strategies, where people are in their trajectory in gaining a foothold in the city and in being able to multiply different livelihood practices and so forth. And what might be a regulatory imperative when they're just starting out won't make sense once they're a bit more consolidated. Let me give a practical example. So in South Africa, for example, in the informal settlements, the liquor industry is overregulated to a certain extent. And for good reason, because most of the violent crime aggregates over weekends around the taverns in the informal settlements. And so from a crime and safety perspective, it's a real issue. However, it's one of the fastest growing informal businesses. And so clearly there is a platform there that one can work with to help those entrepreneurs to run safer, more public interest businesses. And so what is the regulatory response? It can't just be from a safety and security point of view. It has to be about helping them build the scaffolding to run a safe business that doesn't threaten public interest. So that's what I mean. And depending on the age of the settlement, if it's a very new informal settlement, you can't possibly apply the same regulatory standards as you do in a consolidated settlement and so on. And I think that what the planners often miss is what is the criteria that underpins a flexible and adaptive regulatory system so that we can balance public interest, public good, and also the opportunity framework for individual entrepreneurs in these areas as a kind of, just a provisional response. Obviously, outside of a specific example or context, it's hard to get practical. Thanks.
No, wonderful. I think, it's a very interesting reflection and a very interesting example to consider, to narrow the boundaries if you want to justify, when, it might be appropriate and applicable rather than, as a generality. Wonderful. With that, and sorry, because we're, again, running against time, I'm going to move on to the next segment. Our next segment is, is going to review two case studies, one for Barcelona, and a second one will be presented for Brazil. So let me start with our first case study, which is for the city of Barcelona, and which it will explore how local governance and an integral housing policy, which involves cooperatives, community land trusts, and non-profit housing models, are helping address the needs of a changing society from a demographic perspective. The presentation will also look at strategies to prevent displacement in context of high real estate pressure, which is something that we also see much across the region. For that, we have the great honor of introducing Eduard Cabré Romans. He's housing policy advisor at Barcelona City Council. Eduard is also an urban planner and housing policy expert with a strong international trajectory. And over the years, he has held positions in leading European and United States institutions like the Housing Europe in Brussels, the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and the HIC, which has given him a global perspective on urban and housing challenges. He currently serves in the city of Barcelona, the Barcelona City Council, where he's responsible for advancing social housing, urban rehabilitation, and international cooperation. Eduard, thanks so much for being here with us. We look forward to hearing, about the case in Barcelona, which I think is inspiring to many of us across the world. Over to you.
Thank you, Tatiana. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to switch to Spanish also because this is a mainly Latin American audience, and I think it's also a gesture on my part to do it in Spanish. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Let me see. Share. And then. All right. Can you see my screen all right?
It's perfect.
Ok. Pues muchas gracias de nuevo por la invitación. Yo soy Eduard Cabré, trabajo para el Ayuntamiento de Barcelona en el ámbito de la vivienda, concretamente para el Instituto Municipal de la Vivienda y Rehabilitación, que es la empresa pública municipal que gestiona el parque público de vivienda y el suelo municipal en la ciudad. De antemano me disculpo porque parte de mi presentación puede que no sea directamente aplicable a la realidad latinoamericana y del Caribe por estar en un contexto diferente, pero sin embargo muchas de las conclusiones y de los retos creo que son compartidos y verán también que algunas de las soluciones pueden también ser aplicables en sus contextos. Bueno, para empezar, daré un pequeño contexto de la situación de la vivienda en Barcelona. Barcelona, Cataluña, que es la región en la que nos encontramos, y España en su conjunto, tienen una realidad muy distinta con respecto al resto de países europeos. Y esto es porque la política de vivienda en el Estado ha sido fundamentalmente de apoyo al acceso a la propiedad. Desde los años 50, la política estatal fue de subsidio a los promotores, constructores de vivienda social y, por tanto, de apoyo a las familias que querían acceder a la propiedad. Eso conllevó que el parque de vivienda pasó de estar aproximadamente en un 50% ocupado por inquilinos y un 50% por propietarios a un parque fundamentalmente de propietarios, en torno al 80% en el año 2000, ahora un poquito menos, en torno al 75%, y para el caso de la ciudad de Barcelona, en torno a un 60% de propietarios y un 40% de inquilinos. Además de eso, la otra particularidad es que España no ha construido un parque de vivienda social en alquiler como sí existe en otros países europeos, y este parque a día de hoy significa únicamente en torno al 3% del parque de vivienda. En el caso de Barcelona, solo un 1,5% del parque de vivienda es público en régimen de alquiler, y si sumamos otros tipos de vivienda social, estaríamos en torno a este 3%. Todo eso ha conllevado que después de la crisis global financiera del 2008, que conllevó que dejamos de construir mucha vivienda, habíamos construido mucha vivienda hasta ese momento, pero desde ese entonces el ritmo de construcción bajó significativamente. Eso conllevó que las familias, las personas ya no podían acceder a la vivienda en propiedad y competían para acceder a un mercado de alquiler que, como dije, está en torno al 40%. Como toda esa presión, digamos que competía para acceder a un mercado de vivienda limitado, eso conllevó un aumento muy acelerado de los precios de vivienda, principalmente en el ámbito del alquiler, y como resultado que una proporción muy importante de la población que vive en alquiler destina más del 40% de sus ingresos en vivienda. Eso, como sabéis, y para todos los estándares, conlleva pues una dificultad muy importante para vivir también en todos los demás ámbitos de la vida, para poder destinar recursos a otros servicios y necesidades básicos. En paralelo, también vivimos un reto demográfico. España y Europa en general estamos en un proceso de envejecimiento muy acelerado, que conlleva que gran parte de nuestras viviendas están siendo ocupadas por una o dos personas, y que, sin embargo, necesitemos más vivienda para cubrir el mismo número de vivienda, perdón, de población, ¿no? Es decir, para un volumen de población más o menos estable, necesitamos más viviendas, porque esa población vive en hogares con menos personas, comparado evidentemente con la realidad de los años 60 y 70, donde las familias convivían distintas generaciones y, por tanto, en una misma vivienda podían convivir muchas personas. Todo eso nos lleva a que el principal reto a día de hoy para la ciudad es fundamentalmente construir, incrementar el volumen de vivienda, tanto de mercado como especialmente de vivienda social en alquiler. El compromiso de la ciudad de Barcelona y del ayuntamiento es, para los próximos años, construir mucha vivienda, y en el plazo de gobierno actual, que va del año 2024 al año 2027, tenemos previsto entregar 3.000 nuevas viviendas, haber iniciado la construcción de 5.000 viviendas más y haber gestionado suelo en términos de gestión urbanística para 10.000 viviendas más. Además, estamos también redactando el nuevo plan de vivienda para el periodo 2026-2033, que debería permitirnos acelerar la generación de nueva vivienda en la ciudad. Pero todo esto, como se pueden imaginar, son medidas estructurales, medidas que pretenden incrementar vivienda, y eso tarda un tiempo, ¿no? Vamos a tardar unos años en haber generado esta oferta de vivienda que debería permitirnos dar respuesta a la crisis actual. Sin embargo, a corto plazo también desarrollamos medidas de protección y prevención. Y voy a muy sintéticamente explicarles estas medidas en qué consisten. Por un lado, desde el año 2023, inicios del 2024, opera en Cataluña, en la mayor parte de municipios de Cataluña, una regulación de alquileres que ha permitido limitar los alquileres en el mercado privado. Esto es, este 40% de viviendas en Barcelona que se destinan al alquiler, a día de hoy tienen su alquiler regulado. Eso significa que las personas que viven de alquiler no tienen que temer porque su alquiler aumente de un año para otro, ni tan siquiera que en caso que su contrato termine y tengan que firmar un nuevo contrato, haya un aumento de ese alquiler. Eso no se puede dar porque los alquileres, en virtud de esta ley, tienen su precio fijado al precio anterior, ¿no? Al año anterior o al contrato anterior, y solo pueden actualizarse por inflación. Además, en el caso de viviendas propiedad de grandes tenedores, de grandes propietarios de vivienda de más de 5 viviendas, esos alquileres se tienen que ajustar y reducir al precio de alquiler medio del barrio en el que se encuentran. Y esta medida, en el año 2024, ya nos permitió reducir los precios de alquiler en aproximadamente un 6% en la ciudad. Como ven en el gráfico, los precios aumentaron significativamente desde el año 2014, con la excepción del periodo COVID, pero desde la aplicación de esta ley hemos podido frenar y también llegar a reducir el precio de estos alquileres. Además, tenemos un programa, una política de subsidio a una parte de las familias que viven en alquiler privado. Estos son familias de bajos ingresos, muchas de las cuales están recibiendo apoyo de los servicios sociales y que pueden acceder a distintos tipos de ayudas al alquiler o rental vouchers, como se conocen en inglés. Algunas de estas ayudas son permanentes en el tiempo. Una vez la familia las tiene, puede disfrutar de ellas a lo largo del tiempo, y algunas de ellas son temporales únicamente para cubrir necesidades puntuales, por ejemplo, asociadas a la pérdida del trabajo o a necesidades, como digo, temporales. Otra cuestión que en Barcelona es muy relevante son las viviendas de alquiler turístico. Estas son viviendas que en algún momento estaban siendo usadas como viviendas residenciales permanentes, pero que en los últimos años se han destinado al mercado turístico. Sabemos por distintos estudios que se han generado que estas viviendas y su concentración en algunos barrios de la ciudad significan que el precio de la vivienda también residencial sufre un aumento por encima de la media de la ciudad. Es decir, que las viviendas turísticas impactan en el precio del alquiler residencial, y como consecuencia el ayuntamiento ya hace unos años, en 2017, implantó un sistema urbanístico de regulación de estas viviendas que permitió limitar su número a 10.000 viviendas, que son las que actualmente tienen licencia, pero el actual alcalde ha comprometido ya que las viviendas que tienen licencia vayan a perder esa licencia para 2028, y que por tanto las 10.000 viviendas que actualmente tienen un uso turístico van a ser transferidas, digamos, al mercado de vivienda residencial, bien sea en alquiler o en venta. Aquí los propietarios podrán evidentemente decidir, pero ya no podrán destinarlas al uso turístico. Todas estas regulaciones son regulaciones macro, son regulaciones que nos permiten frenar un poco la crisis que estamos viviendo de vivienda para la mayoría de la población. Pero la mayor parte de lo que el ayuntamiento hace es implementar medidas para intentar ampliar el parque de vivienda, y principalmente el parque de vivienda social y asequible. ¿Qué es la vivienda social y asequible en Barcelona o en España? Bueno, son dos tipos de vivienda. No voy a entrar en las cuestiones técnicas, pero fundamentalmente la vivienda asequible es lo que se conoce como vivienda de protección oficial. Es una vivienda que está regulada por ley, su precio está regulado por ley, y también los límites de ingresos y los perfiles de las personas usuarias están regulados por ley. Y por tanto los precios, digamos, que nos vienen pautados son precios aproximadamente en torno al 70% de los precios de mercado, mientras que la vivienda social es aquella vivienda cuyo precio viene predeterminado por los ingresos de la unidad familiar. Por tanto, si la unidad familiar tiene ingresos muy bajos, el alquiler será en torno al 20 o 30% de esos ingresos, y en casos extremos donde no hay ingresos puede ser gratuita la vivienda. Estamos hablando de vivienda extremadamente subsidiada. En el caso de la vivienda pública gestionada por el Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, tenemos un mix de las dos tipologías y por tanto estamos sirviendo, digamos, cubriendo las necesidades de vivienda de un conjunto muy amplio de población, desde familias de ingresos medios y bajos, como también personas mayores, personas jóvenes o personas que pueden estar en situación de calle, ¿no? En situación de sinhogarismo. Además, tenemos edificios que sirven a colectivos en exclusiva, ¿no? de personas mayores o otros colectivos, y también edificios mixtos o viviendas en edificios privados, pero que tienen un uso como vivienda pública porque el ayuntamiento es su propietario. Bien, ¿dónde construimos esas viviendas? Pues fundamentalmente en las zonas de la ciudad donde tenemos oportunidad para construir nueva vivienda. Barcelona es una ciudad muy densa, muy compacta y que además su municipio está prácticamente urbanizado en su totalidad. Por tanto, no tenemos capacidad de crecimiento, pero sí capacidad de transformación de zonas, por ejemplo, industriales que se transforman a usos mixtos o usos residenciales y comerciales. También zonas de transformación, por ejemplo, en torno a infraestructuras ferroviarias, grandes estaciones de tren o la infraestructura del puerto que admite la transformación de usos, la intensificación y densificación y, por tanto, la generación de nuevas viviendas. Cuando se producen transformaciones de este tipo, el ayuntamiento, y aquí tampoco voy a entrar en tecnicalidades, pero tiene derecho a imponer que un porcentaje de las viviendas resultantes sean vivienda protegida, vivienda asequible, este VPO, pero es que además una parte de ese VPO tiene que cederse gratuitamente al ayuntamiento. No las viviendas terminadas, sino el suelo, los terrenos donde se puedan construir esas viviendas. Por tanto, el ayuntamiento recibe de forma gratuita estos terrenos, fruto evidentemente de un proceso de transformación urbanística que le genera al privado, al desarrollador privado, unas plusvalías muy elevadas, y es en virtud de estas plusvalías que se le exige el ceder una parte de esos suelos. Por tanto, el ayuntamiento recibe esos suelos y lo que hace el ayuntamiento con esos suelos es destinarlo o bien a la construcción de vivienda pública a través de su propio instituto público de vivienda, o bien ceder esos terrenos a otras entidades, a otros desarrolladores, para que construyan vivienda asequible. Y aquí voy a explicarles un poco las distintas modalidades. Como les digo, hay una modalidad puramente pública, que es fundamentalmente de alquiler y otras tipologías, y luego en colaboración con terceros. Muy rápidamente, Tatiana, entiendo que voy corto de tiempo. En el ámbito público estamos construyendo mucha vivienda, hemos acelerado muchísimo la producción de vivienda, fundamentalmente a través de la construcción industrializada. Esto es el uso de métodos constructivos, por ejemplo, con madera o con módulos 3D ¿no? de metal. También, por ejemplo, con el uso de contenedores marítimos y su reciclaje para acelerar el proceso tanto en tiempo como también en cuanto a su huella de carbono, que nos ha permitido también reducirla extremadamente. Aquí ven algunas de nuestras promociones industrializadas y también el perfil de nuestros usuarios. Paso muy rápidamente en el ámbito de las colaboraciones público-privadas. Hemos sido muy innovadores, por ejemplo, en establecer un convenio con cooperativas de vivienda y fundaciones de vivienda social en alquiler, a través del cual les cedemos en derecho de superficie el derecho a construir vivienda en suelo público por 99 años. Esto quiere decir que después de los 99 años estas entidades tienen que devolver el edificio a la municipalidad, pero durante estos 99 años construyen y gestionan estas viviendas. Como digo, esto es un mix de vivienda en alquiler y en régimen cooperativo, y estamos también trabajando con ellas en desarrollar un modelo Community Land Trust vinculado a esta colaboración entre estas entidades. Hemos constituido también una empresa de capital mixto público-privado. Esto es finalmente una empresa de promoción y construcción de vivienda que tiene un 50% de capital privado y un 50% de capital público, que nos permitirá construir vivienda de alquiler tanto en el Ayuntamiento Municipio de Barcelona como en las demás entidades y municipios de su entorno. Y estamos también haciendo concursos abiertos para que otros promotores de vivienda, tanto sin ánimo de lucro como con ánimo de lucro puedan acceder a suelo municipal en derecho de superficie. Como digo, nunca perdemos la propiedad del suelo, pero sí con estos 99 años que les van a permitir recuperar su inversión. Muy rápidamente, desde el ayuntamiento también compramos edificios terminados, compramos vivienda en el mercado privado. Tenemos un derecho de compra preferente para algunos edificios y aquí hay muchas excepciones, ¿eh? Aquí las technicalidades son muy importantes, pero tenemos el derecho de comprar preferentemente algunas viviendas, como digo, a precio de mercado. En los últimos años hemos comprado más de 1.600 viviendas que pasan a formar parte del parque público. Esta política es muy importante porque nos permite tener vivienda pública en esos barrios, en esos entornos donde no podemos construir porque ya no hay suelo disponible. Es por tanto una política orientada a asegurar la cohesión social y la mixtura social en todos los barrios de la ciudad. Y tenemos también dos programas de intermediación por el que ofrecemos incentivos, por ejemplo, ayudas ayudas a la rehabilitación a propietarios privados a cambio de que alquilen sus viviendas a un precio inferior al de mercado. Estos son, no voy a entrar en el detalle, pero dos programas que nos permiten de nuevo aflorar vivienda, en este caso privada, para que se alquile a un precio reducido durante un plazo de tiempo. Y finalmente, políticas de rehabilitación. Como he dicho al principio, nuestro parque es fundamentalmente privado, está en manos privadas y está envejeciendo. Entonces, desde el ayuntamiento tenemos distintas políticas de apoyo a la rehabilitación de ese parque, también con fondos europeos, que son estos Next Generation provenientes del esfuerzo de reconstrucción post pandemia de la COVID. Que nos han permitido incidir sobre todo en la rehabilitación energética de estos edificios, en mejoras de accesibilidad en estos edificios y que en algunos casos nos permiten también asegurar que esta rehabilitación no conlleva gentrificación, sino que esta rehabilitación es usada por los habitantes de esas viviendas y que en caso de que vendan esas viviendas tengan que devolver el subsidio o se comprometan a alquilarlas a un precio inferior al de mercado. Siento haberme alargado mucho. Tenemos también muchas iniciativas con otras ciudades europeas de las que podría hablar y estoy a su disposición para resolver cualquier duda. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Eduard. La verdad, la que siente digamos, el tener que acelerar un poco la sesión soy yo, porque creo que muchos de los instrumentos que habéis, digamos, piloteado en Barcelona, ya sean instrumentos, digamos, de alquiler, instrumentos de uso de suelo, de, digamos, alianzas público-privadas, han sido realmente innovadores y creo que para muchas de las ciudades de nuestra región pueden ser un ejemplo importante. Así que nos llevamos, obviamente, esta sesión, esta presentación y seguro que también muchos pedidos de contacto para seguir conversando. Perfecto. Con eso voy a pasar a la última presentación de hoy. Y la verdad, voy a volver al inglés, perdón, se me pasó de un idioma al otro sin darme cuenta, pero creo que es importante para presentar ahora a Augusto Ravelo, who is the National Secretary of Housing of Brazil. Secretary Ravelo leads the federal government's housing agenda, advancing policies that aim to reduce inequality, expand access to adequate housing, and strengthen coordination across levels of government. Under his leadership, Brazil has been working to address the needs of informal populations, recognize the diversity of households and labor conditions, and overcome the challenges of scaling implementation nationwide. Today, we have the great pleasure to have him with us to share key insights from Brazil's experience in designing and executing national housing policies for informal populations, offering lessons that may inspire many, and especially, we would love to hear about all the new approaches and all the new innovations that you're introducing, Augusto. With that, sorry for the slight delay that we have, and thank you so much for being with us. And the floor is yours.
Muito obrigado, Tatiana. Muito obrigado a todos que aqui participam desse evento. Pude acompanhar aqui boa parte do debate e muito interessante, muito importante a gente estar aqui debatendo conjuntamente essas iniciativas que envolvem a habitação. Bom, aqui, como já foi dito, eu estou na Secretaria Nacional de Habitação, comandando aqui a pasta. Nós temos uma diversidade de iniciativas e de programas aqui, no guarda-chuva, né, na órbita do programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, e vai ser um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Eu vou já compartilhar aqui a minha tela. Espero que vocês estejam vendo. Só me sinalizem se estão vendo aí a
Estamos
apresentação.
vendo.
Tá ótimo. Então vamos lá. A apresentação está em inglês. Eu vou falar em português, vou pedir a liberdade aqui de falar na minha língua nativa, mais fácil para a gente poder explicar. Mas a apresentação está em inglês. Colocamos aqui para poder também facilitar um pouco o acompanhamento dos slides. Vamos começar então. O programa vocês devem já conhecer, o programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, né, um programa criado em 2009 pelo presidente Lula, criado lá atrás com o objetivo de ser política habitacional, mas também com um viés de política econômica, no sentido de movimentação, no sentido do crédito, da geração de empregos. E o programa tem um histórico aí que eu adoraria repassar aqui com vocês, mas pelo tempo a gente precisa encurtar um pouco. Basicamente, o programa que foi muito bem, foi criado num tamanho já muito robusto. Nos idos de 2019, 2020, ele foi extinto, e agora, com o terceiro mandato do presidente Lula, ele recria o Ministério das Cidades, convida o ministro Jader Filho para comandar a pasta, e o ministro recria o programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, e eu vou mostrar aqui o patamar e as iniciativas gerais que nós estamos tomando. Mas seguindo aqui a nossa tela, nós temos hoje no Brasil feitas, desde 2009 até hoje, mais de 9 milhões de unidades habitacionais construídas e entregues. Esse número é um número recorde em toda a história do país, e nós estamos trabalhando aí para que esse número cresça a cada ano. Dentro do Minha Casa Minha Vida, nós temos tanto o incentivo para produção de unidades habitacionais novas, construção de casas, como também o financiamento. Então, a produção que é feita com recurso da União, com recurso do governo federal, para poder fornecer a custo zero para as famílias mais pobres, mas também a gente tem a linha do financiamento, né? E nós atendemos aqui no Minha Casa Minha Vida, de fato, desde aquela pessoa que tem renda zero, que recebe algum auxílio financeiro do governo, como o Bolsa Família, que também é uma política mundialmente conhecida, desde essas famílias até, mais recentemente, as famílias que ganham 12 mil reais, que nós já chamamos aqui no Brasil de classe média, né? Indo adiante, mostrando aqui um mapa relativamente simplificado dos nossos atores. O Ministério das Cidades define a política pública, é quem normatiza, é quem dá as diretrizes gerais e de monitoramento. A Caixa Econômica Federal é um banco público que é extremamente importante para esse processo, é um banco público com uma vocação de apoio às políticas públicas. Então, muitas políticas públicas do Brasil, elas são operacionalizadas pela Caixa Econômica. A Caixa Econômica é um parceiro estratégico do Estado brasileiro, e ela, então, dentro do Minha Casa Minha Vida, é o nosso braço operacional, é quem recebe as propostas de projetos habitacionais, é quem faz análise de engenharia, é quem acompanha essas obras, faz as medições e, no final das contas, nos apoia na entrega dessas casas. Então, nós temos aqui na Caixa, o nosso arranjo institucional, ele tem na Caixa esse aspecto bastante importante de operar a política pública, e aí, com a capilaridade que a Caixa tem em todo o país, né, ela estando presente em todos os estados, em todas as capitais, em muitas cidades médias, a gente consegue fazer esse bom acompanhamento do avanço das obras. Temos os entes subnacionais, governos estaduais e prefeituras participam do programa, apresentando propostas e também entrando com contrapartida financeira. A gente faz essa parceria federativa para que situações específicas pelo país tenha um complemento financeiro que viabilize esses projetos, e também esses entes são os que apresentam as famílias, né? Elas fazem um cadastro habitacional e apresentam, após uma determinada análise de critérios, apresentam para a Caixa Econômica a lista de quem vai ser beneficiado naquele empreendimento especificamente. Temos as construtoras, vale dizer aqui que o Minha Casa Minha Vida, ele é uma parceria público-privada, porque as construtoras, elas não só fazem a execução da obra, há a possibilidade delas mesmas apresentarem os projetos habitacionais, então nós não ficamos contando somente com o poder público enquanto mobilizador de projetos, a gente conta com as construtoras, isso anda nas duas frentes, e é isso que fez o Minha Casa Minha Vida, comparativamente a outras iniciativas no Brasil, ter uma velocidade maior, porque a gente conta com o dinamismo e com a velocidade e com o interesse econômico mesmo dessas construtoras. Então, elas apresentam projetos, elas fazem a relação com a Caixa de troca de documentos e tocam a obra sempre na maior velocidade possível, porque para eles é importante. Mas nós temos também aqui na nossa política habitacional os movimentos sociais, que são as entidades sociais organizadoras, que elas também participam do processo de apresentação de propostas e muitas vezes até de construção, de fato, de empreendimentos habitacionais. Esse aqui, pessoal, é a nossa grande arquitetura, ela é mais complexa, envolve outros atores, envolve fundos de governo, que nós temos recursos, mas, resumindo bem, essa é a nossa arquitetura. Então, como eu já tinha antecipado, Minha Casa Minha Vida, enquanto guarda-chuva, a gente usa aqui no Brasil essa figura de linguagem, né? Enquanto órbita ali de ações, a gente tem uma preocupação muito grande de estar endereçando alternativas diferentes a depender da faixa de renda das famílias. Então, nós atendemos um raio bem importante de famílias no Brasil, e nós atendemos tanto no sentido da moradia a custo zero, para quem mais precisa, quanto a moradia financiada, mas com apoio de taxa de juros, com apoio de prazo estendido, com apoio de valor na entrada do financiamento. Então, nós temos aqui, esse é um ponto de destaque da política habitacional, ela não é só uma política que depende, vamos dizer assim, do orçamento 100% financiado da União. Nós usamos o financiamento como uma ferramenta de expandir o nosso alcance, e isso faz da política habitacional muito sustentável, porque nós não estamos apostando somente todas as fichas naquele recurso orçamentário que nós sabemos que é escasso, que é disputado entre todos os ministérios. Então, a nossa estratégia ela é dupla. Mas, além disso, a gente também propõe e trata diferentes soluções dependendo do perfil, vamos dizer assim, sociodemográfico, geográfico do país. Então, nós temos uma modalidade que atende cidades com mais de 50 mil habitantes. Só para vocês terem uma ideia, cerca de 90% dos municípios brasileiros eles estão abaixo dessa quantidade de 50 mil habitantes. Alguns estados, como Minas Gerais, têm, na sua maioria, cidades muito pequenas, entre 10 mil habitantes, nessa faixa de renda, nessa faixa de quantidade de habitantes. Mas nós temos, então, uma linha para as grandes cidades, grandes e médias cidades, vamos dizer assim. Nós temos uma linha para as pequenas cidades, temos uma linha para a habitação rural e temos uma linha que ela atende grandes e médias e pequenas cidades, mas com a participação dessas entidades sociais, desses movimentos sociais, que são, muitas vezes, movimentos que historicamente já lutam por habitação e trazem essa capacidade de produzir projetos habitacionais. Então, temos um leque aberto para atender as diferentes formas, em cada uma dessas modalidades, algumas regras e alguns valores, enfim, algumas especificações são diferentes para que a gente possa, de fato, estar atendendo com flexibilidade esses perfis diferentes. Esse mapa aqui é a tradução dessas modalidades, então nós temos ali 4 linhas de atendimento que são subsidiadas, nós usamos aqui esse termo, que quer dizer que vem orçamento direto, a custo direto da União, orçamento para a construção das casas, e essas famílias depois vão receber essa casa praticamente a custo zero. E na segunda linha, o financiamento, que é, de fato, como eu já disse, nós temos diversas medidas para facilitar esse financiamento, para torná-lo acessível, isso é muito importante. E criamos também ali no último quadrinho, Minha Casa Minha Vida Cidades, que é nada mais nada menos que um formato de parceria. Nós apoiamos o cidadão com um valor na entrada, no primeiro pagamento do financiamento, e estamos permitindo que outros entes públicos também entrem nessa composição de valores, nessa composição de recursos, para facilitar ainda mais a entrada, né? A gente usa aqui esse termo entrada, que é justamente aquele valor que você tem que pagar à vista para você poder financiar o restante do valor do empreendimento. E eu vou mostrar o impacto que isso está acontecendo, qual o impacto que isso está trazendo hoje no país. Mas só abrindo um pouco o quadro aqui, eu acompanhei algumas apresentações que trouxeram dados, e aí eu rapidamente aqui inseri algumas estatísticas muito interessantes e que são recentes, foram publicadas há poucas semanas, um mês atrás, mais ou menos, referente ao déficit habitacional no Brasil. Aqui nós temos dois pilares de estatística, um é o déficit habitacional e o outro é a inadequação habitacional. O déficit habitacional está relacionado a moradias precárias, pessoas que moram em moradias precárias, a coabitação, que seria ali o formato de você ter muita gente morando no mesmo lugar, isso traz um resultado de uma necessidade de casa, e o ônus excessivo do aluguel. Esse é um termo técnico, mas que significa o seguinte: as pessoas que ganham ali até 2 salários mínimos, o quanto que elas estão pagando em excesso, acima de 30% da sua renda, em aluguel. Ou seja, quando que o aluguel ele passa a ser já um problema, ele passa a ser algo que está tensionando o orçamento mensal daquela família, e naturalmente a solução seria aquela família ter uma casa própria e não mais o aluguel. Então nós medimos isso anualmente, e o resultado recente foi de uma diminuição. Então, no Brasil, no ano de 2023, houve uma redução do déficit habitacional, indo para o seu menor patamar histórico em termos relativos, percentuais, e para uma quantidade de 5,9 milhões de domicílios. Essa seria a nossa necessidade de habitação. Dá para perceber que esse déficit ele tem cara, ele tem rosto, ele tem nome, ele impacta nas mulheres, né? Aqui 61%, ele impacta mais nas famílias de menor renda, nas famílias pretas ou pardas, que historicamente são famílias que guardam um resquício ainda de desigualdades sociais estruturais na nossa sociedade, e, claro, isso se pronuncia de forma mais assertiva no aspecto urbano do país, que é onde está concentrada a nossa maior parte da população. As diferentes regiões do Brasil, eu não vou me deter aqui no detalhe, mas é só para contribuir e para vocês terem essa noção. As diferentes regiões do país, nós temos 5 regiões, elas têm características diferentes do déficit. Então, por exemplo, o ônus excessivo do aluguel, ele se manifesta de uma maneira mais volumosa na região sudeste, que é a região mais urbanizada, é uma região que concentra, de forma geral, economicamente, o maior peso no país. Então, já não é a mesma situação, por exemplo, na região norte. Na região norte você tem outros problemas que são mais graves, né? Então, todas as regiões têm todo tipo de dinâmica do déficit, mas é só para mostrar que o Brasil ele tem as diferentes regiões têm diferentes necessidades, e o quadro do déficit dentro daqueles 3 componentes que eu mencionei, ele é diferente. Mas hoje nós temos no Brasil, de forma muito pronunciada, muito relevante, o componente mais relevante é o ônus excessivo do aluguel, e eu vou mostrar como que a gente está atacando isso aqui no país de uma maneira muito robusta, tá? Falei do ônus excessivo, estou falando e mencionei também a habitação precária, que são domicílios rústicos, com materiais e paredes aí, enfim, com materiais que são improvisados, materiais, enfim, que não são adequados ali para a moradia, né? Seja a taipa, seja a madeira e outros formatos de material. Mas nós temos, aí vocês já observam que mudou um pouco. Na região norte, o problema da habitação precária é um pouco mais relevante do que, por exemplo, na região sudeste, que é essa região que está mais clara aqui. Não sei se vocês enxergam o meu cursor, mas quero mostrar com esses 2 slides só que o Brasil tem as diferentes regiões têm diferentes desafios. E aqui eu entro já mostrando o que está acontecendo hoje na política habitacional brasileira, tá? Esse quadro eu vou explicá-lo da seguinte forma. Aqui você tem 4 grupos de renda, certo? Que são os nossos 4 grupos dentro do Minha Casa Minha Vida. O grupo 1, das famílias que ganham até R$ 2.850, é o grupo de faixa de renda mais baixa. Esse grupo, historicamente, sempre foi atendido por aquelas modalidades que a União, que o governo federal entra com recurso a custo zero, ok? Historicamente, a partir do grupo 2 é que o financiamento atingia de uma maneira mais relevante. Então, essas pessoas do grupo 1 ou vinha aquela casa a custo zero, que é num volume, numa quantidade muito menor do que é necessário, ou elas ficavam, de fato, apertadas, porque elas não tinham condição de acessar o crédito, elas não tinham condição de acessar o financiamento, e é justamente nesse ponto que o governo do presidente Lula, na gestão aqui do ministro Jader, nós estamos fazendo uma verdadeira revolução. Porque o que nós fizemos agora foi permitir, não só diminuir a taxa de juros dos financiamentos, mas fazer aquilo que eu já comentei. O governo federal entra com um apoio financeiro para a entrada, para o pagamento inicial daquele financiamento, num valor alto, de até R$ 55 mil. Quando a gente permite que outros entes públicos também entrem nessa conta, muitas vezes nós estamos já na largada, ajudando aquela família com metade do valor do imóvel e ela financia a outra metade, por exemplo. O que está acontecendo no país? As pessoas estão saindo do aluguel e indo para um financiamento habitacional mais barato do que elas estavam pagando de aluguel. Com isso, a gente começa a endereçar aquele componente do ônus excessivo do aluguel que eu comentei com vocês, e ao mesmo tempo a gente está dando oportunidade para que essas famílias de renda mais baixa possam sair dessa pressão, né, seja de uma casa precária, seja do aluguel que aperta no financiamento. Então, esse quadrante vermelho é para destacar que hoje, no Minha Casa Minha Vida, a maior quantidade de unidades habitacionais que estão sendo financiadas está concentrada nessa faixa de renda, e isso é o que a gente quer. Até muitos anos atrás, esse quadrante ele estaria localizado um pouco mais ali para o grupo 2, grupo 3. E nós conseguimos, com essas medidas, fazer esse ajuste. A estatística que eu posso citar para vocês, e que é muito poderosa, é a seguinte: a cada 3 financiamentos habitacionais no Brasil, 1 vai para essas famílias de renda mais baixa. E é justamente isso, nós entendemos que nós estamos totalmente adequados ao que o Brasil, a que a população brasileira precisa, que é de fato ter acesso a um financiamento mais democrático. E com isso a gente consegue ganhar escala. Nós estamos chegando num patamar. Deixa eu só voltar aqui para esse slide, mas só para dizer o seguinte: nós estamos chegando num patamar hoje, historicamente, do ápice do Minha Casa Minha Vida. Com todos os ajustes que foram feitos, nós estamos num volume muito alto de financiamentos. No ano de 2024, fizemos 605 mil financiamentos habitacionais, são 605 mil famílias atendidas nessas faixas de renda. Já foi um recorde histórico em todos os tempos, e esse ano nós vamos bater esse próprio recorde, e com isso a gente avança a passos largos. Esse aqui é só um histórico de quantos contratos foram feitos ao longo dos anos. Observem que a gente já está num teto histórico. O ano de 2025 está ali com 461 mil, já está no número mais elevado, e vai, sem dúvida, passar o número de 605 mil. Então, nós estamos, a partir do retorno do programa Minha Casa Minha Vida oficialmente em 2023, a gente está aumentando o patamar de financiamento, e a gente entende que isso tem uma sustentabilidade muito grande, porque o dinheiro que eu poderia gastar, fazendo uma conta simples, né? O dinheiro que eu gastaria para fazer uma casa, eu consigo utilizá-lo melhor se eu estou ajudando com uma parte no financiamento. Eu consigo, dessa forma, ajudar mais famílias, né, do que o dinheiro só para uma casa. Mas uma linha não anula outra, porque, de fato, existem famílias no Brasil que não têm condição de fazer o financiamento. Então, essas famílias, a gente consegue focalizar ainda mais aqueles recursos que são destinados a custo zero para as famílias. Esse aqui é um outro quadro que deixa de maneira mais drástica, de maneira mais dramática, o que se passou no Brasil nos últimos anos. Então, observem que em 2018 para 2019 há uma queda drástica das contratações, tá? Essas são as contratações das modalidades, de todas as modalidades, exceto as de financiamento. As de financiamento eu mostrei no slide anterior. Então, aqui nós temos a modalidade rural, para os municípios abaixo de 50 mil habitantes, para a modalidade de entidades sociais e para cidades acima de 50 mil habitantes. Observe, então, que aí não tem nenhuma falha de gráfico, tá? Não é o estagiário não esqueceu de preencher nenhuma dessas colunas. É verdade, a verdade é essa, é que durante os anos de 2019 a 2022 não houve política habitacional, não houve uma contratação para habitação de interesse social nessas modalidades. E aí em 2024, 23, 24, nós retomamos esse patamar e já estamos nos aproximando novamente do nosso teto histórico de contratações. Então, isso aqui é para mostrar que a retomada do Minha Casa Minha Vida no Brasil, ela foi rápida e ela foi muito robusta, porque nós já conseguimos voltar aos patamares históricos. Falando sobre o novo Minha Casa Minha Vida, já trazendo aqui para uma da nossa metade para o final da nossa conversa, nós estamos hoje chegando, de 2023 para cá, ao número de 1,8 milhões de unidades habitacionais contratadas. E aí vale dizer o seguinte, quando o ministro Jader assumiu aqui o ministério, ele pactuou com o presidente Lula uma meta. A meta era construir e contratar 2 milhões de unidades habitacionais até o final de 2026. O que acontece é que, pelo número que vocês podem observar, nós já estamos chegando nessa meta de 2 milhões, só que agora no final de 2025. Então, dizendo em outras palavras, nós estamos batendo a nossa meta com um ano de antecedência, e obviamente o presidente Lula, muito atento e muito valorizando muito a habitação, ele já nos pediu que a gente aumentasse essa meta, e nós vamos chegar à meta de 3 milhões de unidades habitacionais, ou seja, vamos fazer 1 milhão de unidades habitacionais no ano que vem, e esse aí vai ser sim, de fato, um patamar histórico de recorde, num curto período de tempo, de contratações do Minha Casa Minha Vida. São 256 bilhões de reais de investimento pelo financiamento, outros 30 bilhões nos investimentos diretos da União. E nós já atendemos no Brasil, se nós somarmos todas as nossas modalidades, 4.800 municípios, 86% dos municípios brasileiros estão atendidos, somente contando as novas contratações feitas de 2023 para cá. Eu já falei aqui dos números recordes, então não vou me deter aqui nessa tela, já passei por esses números todos. Aqui é só para mostrar a nossa rede de cobertura, como eu acabei de mencionar, né? 4.804 municípios. Observem ali na região norte, o interior do Pará, o interior do estado do Amazonas, ali fazendo fronteira com Venezuela, com Colômbia, com Peru. Nós chegamos em todos os locais do Brasil, da pequena cidade, da tribo indígena, da aldeia, da comunidade quilombola, da comunidade ribeirinha, até os grandes centros urbanos do país. Uma coisa muito importante que eu queria destacar aqui para todos é que o Minha Casa Minha Vida, quando volta, ele não volta do mesmo jeito que ele era. Ele volta com os aprendizados e com as lições que o tempo e a realidade nos ensinou. Então, nós trazemos uma coisa muito importante, que é uma diretriz de que qualquer empreendimento do Minha Casa Minha Vida hoje, para ele ser aprovado, para ele ser selecionado, ele precisa estar na malha urbana, ele precisa estar perto dos equipamentos públicos, como posto de saúde, escola, creche, comércio, acesso pavimentado. Então, nós estamos trazendo uma inversão da lógica. Hoje, se um prefeito, quando eu atendo um prefeito aqui, ele fala que ele quer construir uma casa, que ele quer, enfim, construir um projeto do Minha Casa Minha Vida, primeiro eu pergunto para ele: prefeito, o senhor tem escola, creche, posto de saúde perto desse terreno que você quer fazer? Se ele me responder que não, então a resposta para ele vai ser: prefeito, o senhor tem que providenciar alguma infraestrutura urbana e equipamentos para poder ter um projeto do Minha Casa Minha Vida. Com isso, a gente inverte a lógica e aquela aposta de que, se você coloca uma casa longe, o serviço chega até lá em algum momento. Isso não necessariamente aconteceu em todos nos nossos empreendimentos passados. E agora a gente inverte, então, aperta um pouco mais essa lógica, mas faz com que o que é mais importante para a gente aconteça. Quando essa família se mudar de um lugar e ir para esse novo empreendimento, ela já está indo para um local que vai dar oportunidade de acesso a serviços públicos, oportunidade de emprego, oportunidade de estar dentro da cidade, né? E ter com isso qualidade de vida e acontecer de fato a transformação social que a gente quer que aconteça para todas essas famílias. Então essa para mim é a grande qualidade que o novo Minha Casa Minha Vida traz quando a gente exige essa inserção dos terrenos. Também temos colocado algumas medidas de sustentabilidade, aos poucos nós temos avançado nesse tema, com a previsão de mais árvores por metro quadrado dentro do empreendimento, com um incentivo a jardins, a hortas urbanas e outras medidas de, vamos dizer assim, de ajuste, de conforto térmico dentro dos materiais utilizados nos empreendimentos. E chegamos, então, num quadro também, eu estou aqui falando de recordes, mas é porque, de fato, é isso que está acontecendo. Hoje nós temos mais de 1 milhão de unidades habitacionais em construção no país. Se nós pegarmos todo o apoio que é dado à construção via iniciativa privada e pelos recursos diretamente do governo federal. Então, também é um número já, é um patamar histórico dentro da nossa política. Aqui, vou falar muito rapidamente, só para mencionar, porque nós lançamos ontem, né, antes de ontem, na verdade, um novo programa aqui no país, que vai atacar um outro pilar dos nossos problemas habitacionais, que é o da inadequação. A inadequação, elas são vários componentes, mas tem um tipo de inadequação que a gente chama de inadequação edilícia, e que essa inadequação a gente pretende atacar com esse programa que vocês estão vendo aí, que é o Reforma Casa Brasil, 40 bilhões de reais. Vocês podem já comparar, eu disse que toda uma linha nossa aqui de atendimento era de 30 bilhões, e nós estamos lançando uma linha agora de financiamento, de crédito, para as famílias poderem pegar o seu financiamento e fazer a sua reforma na própria casa. São 40 bilhões de reais que entram agora nessa frente de trabalho, que começa já num patamar muito relevante. A gente entende que era uma necessidade histórica da política habitacional brasileira endereçar o assunto da reforma, da inadequação. A pessoa não necessariamente ela precisa de uma casa nova, ela precisa melhorar a condição de habitabilidade, de salubridade, de conforto e até mesmo de sustentabilidade. Então, com isso, a gente lança aí um novo programa que a gente está muito otimista. Quem tiver algum interesse em conhecer um pouco mais das nossas modalidades, tem aqui esses QR Codes, mas isso vocês podem também encontrar no site do Ministério das Cidades. Queria agradecer aqui a participação de todos. O tempo é sempre muito curto para a gente falar de tantos assuntos, mas a nossa mensagem aqui é essa, é que na política habitacional brasileira está muito robusta, aprendeu com as lições do tempo, e a gente está aqui em permanente diálogo, ouvindo e procurando fazer com que a nossa política se modernize, avance, e, sobretudo, que a gente consiga. O desafio no Brasil é sempre um desafio continental, como a gente diz. É um país continental com uma população enorme, então tudo aqui precisa ser muito grande para a gente poder fazer frente ao desafio, senão a gente fica só enxugando gelo. E aí o que a gente procura fazer, e a nossa meta mais próxima agora, é chegar nesses 3 milhões de unidades habitacionais contratadas, e com isso a gente contribuir para a diminuição do déficit. Queria agradecer a todos e estamos aqui à disposição. Muito obrigado.
Parabéns, Augusto, pelo novo programa. Muito obrigada pela sua intervenção. And I move back to English. As we close the session of today, I would like to thank all our speakers and participants for an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Throughout the webinar, we have explored how structural inequalities, demographic dynamics, and policy choices shape who can access adequate housing and why many still cannot. We have heard valuable insights from global and regional experiences, from the African and Latin American contexts to the cases of Barcelona and Brazil, showing both the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. As we move forward, let us continue to connect these lessons to concrete actions, strengthening collaboration between governments, civil society, the private sector, and international partners to ensure that housing truly reaches those who need it most. I would like also to take this opportunity to invite you for the upcoming webinar, which will be held on November 19th, and which we have titled Systems and Models. How is the housing of the future being built now? Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for having stayed with us up to the end of this webinar. And we look forward to seeing you on the 19th. Bye.